morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. But I think before I start, I'm going to make a disclosure. I'm a clinician amidst all of you, mainly basic researchers. So what I'm going to talk about is really gloss over the larger and broader areas of the brain and mind and leave it to the real scientists, perhaps, who are going to perhaps discuss more of this in detail. Shona mentioned the Tale of Two Cities. I just thought I'd go to Lewis Carroll and talk of this particular presentation in terms of through the looking glass. Because I think, as he mentioned, the area of the brain and mind is something truly fascinating, quite difficult to understand. You seem to have found so much. There are so many new investigative approaches to understanding the brain and the mind, and yet we have not been able to truly translate it, particularly when we talk about degenerative disorders of the brain and mind. So what I'm going to do is to really give you an overview of what kind of approaches we've been using at NIMHANS to study it, what are the excellent opportunities there are, because I think there's much more to come in the decades ahead, and how can we use some of these opportunities going forward. So all of you, in terms of history, I'm also a historian. My colleague, Dr. Sanjeev Jain, who does history as well as molecular biology. We've been looking at all the records of the old mental hospital. And for those of you who know Bangalore, this is the Mysore, State Bank of Mysore, now the State Bank of India headquarters. And that used to be the mental hospital in Bangalore in the 1850s. We moved to our new premises about 1935. And since there, it's been 70 years of the first postgraduate institute of mental health in the country, and of course, NIMHANS, which was established in 1974, combining mental health and neurological disorders. So I don't think there are too many institutions anywhere in the world which exclusively study the brain and mind. So I think we have the unique distinction of being able to do that for the last almost 70 years. And of course, recently we commemorated 50 years of NIMHANS, and therefore, perhaps we now have a lot of consolidation, and with the availability of artificial intelligence, deep machine learning, and so on, the kind of data that is available in terms of patients is huge and can be very, very useful in informing further practice. So we need to look at that going forward. Our hospital statistics, you see that we now have touched nearly 7 lakh footfalls in a year. So it's a huge and very, very busy campus with a lot of patients who come in from all over the country. So even in terms of ethnic diversities, we have people coming from different parts of the country representing different backgrounds, and therefore a very, very good melting pot of Indian ethnicities. And of course, we are an NABH accredited hospital. I know I'm standing in the Indian Institute of Science, which is now going to build a hospital of its own. It's taken us many years of very, very hard work to be perhaps the only institute of national importance in the country, in the public space, which is accredited by the NABH and is re-accredited recently. So we have 3 broad divisions, and that is what is very exciting about NIMHANS. We have a basic sciences division, which you will see. There's a lot of work, both in the laboratory as well as on the bench, but very often looks at translational impact of many of these disciplines in terms of trying to understand patients. We do have a central animal research facility, and we have the biological research center, where many of the labs of colleagues who work in these departments are concerned. But we also have always been encouraging clinician scientists. So there are neurologists, there are psychiatrists, there are neurosurgeons who also work, for example, with animal models, with the departments of biophysics, neurophysiology, and so on. In neurophysiology, I just wanted to mention that we have a Center for Consciousness Studies, again, which is trying to look at the very, very, the clinical aspects of consciousness or, deep coma, to understanding, the concepts of philosophy and enlightenment and so on. Similarly, we have the Department of Biophysics, which does a lot of the work that you were talking about initially, proteomics, cellular mechanisms, crystallography, and so on. We have a Department of Psychopharmacology, which looks at drug metabolism and measurement of drug levels. Of course, we have the Department of Human Genetics and the Department of Neurovirology, which particularly during COVID took a lot of initiative. So, some examples of biomarkers that we would be interested in. Take a typical example of cancer biomarkers. We don't do cancer biomarkers, but it's very, very important that we've seen that cancer biomarkers can be very important in prognosticating conditions like ovarian cancer, breast cancer, and so on. So we at NIMHANS, the colleagues are looking at brain tumors and possible markers used in, for example, glioblastoma and other tumors. So they're looking at promoter methylation areas, chromosomal translocations, various other kinds of mutations, particularly in certain tumors like astrocytomas, oligodendrogliomas, and so on. So therefore, looking at markers becomes a very, very important area to be able to offer prognostication. Similarly, a lot of the high throughput omics as well as DNA sequencing approaches are used in diagnostics, and they are very useful in neurological disorders, in neuromuscular disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders, something that we are seeing much, much more of, in the child and adolescent psychiatry as well as in the pediatric neurology and mitochondrial disorders. And of course, we do whole genome analysis, we do sequencing, we do clinical exome analysis, mutational analysis, and mitochondrial DNA analysis to address some of these disorders. A whole range of omics are things that colleagues do, and that's particularly useful in infections, in epilepsy, in rabies, in Guillain-Barré syndrome, brain tumors, and endocrinal diseases as well. And we are looking at strengthening these proteomic facilities so that there can be much greater application in terms of training and service in the days to come. We have a good department of genetics. We have a section which does a lot of molecular genetics, and this certainly will give us a much better idea about the genetic constitution of various ethnicities, better understanding of the genetic origins of various complex disorders, and of course, developing disease-specific gene panels for diagnostic testing, the early and accurate diagnosis. In fact, I was just discussing with my colleague who works in dementia that perhaps the way we are going is really, particularly for Alzheimer's, to try and see if you can make a diagnostic test so that people know what kind of prognosis is likely and what kind of disorders you might actually exclude. And we do know that the advantages can mean less invasive procedures, which from a patient point of view is extremely useful. And of course, certain diagnostic dilemmas. I think it's easier said than done, because we do know sometimes that one particular disease overlaps. For example, Alzheimer's might overlap with vascular causes for dementias, and that might pose more questions than answers. However, when you look at personalized treatment, perhaps we're looking at more acute prognostication and therapeutics as far as disorders are concerned. Estimation of risk, particularly in tumors, even perhaps in psychotic disorders, looking at the risks of relapse in some patients, and some patients having more, single episodes. What is the reason why that happens? Maybe we can do an estimation of that. Prenatal diagnosis, certainly extremely important when the disorders are genetically transmitted. And when you look at targeted molecular therapeutics, again, the possibility of using genomics, and of course, epigenetics, which is really the buzzwords in the last couple of decades, where in psychiatric disorders, to look at addiction, for example, I think there was some discussion about addiction earlier on, and to really predict why certain people relapse, even if the person stops drinking, for example, what kind of epigenetic changes take a long time to recover, might be very useful in following up addiction and psychosis. Similarly, epigenetics can be very useful in understanding the effect of stress on animal models as well as on human beings, drug exposure and its effects. Postpartum depression is another area where colleagues are looking at what might be the impact of the environment of stress to the fetus and how it might affect the subsequent development of the fetus. In Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, definitely epigenetic factors are very, very important to look at, as they are in neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. So, the other thing is to look at inflammatory hypothesis. Inflammatory hypothesis and the gut-brain axis are now very, very exciting areas that people are looking at, and therefore seeing how neuroinflammatory processes activate microglia, the astrocytes and the neurons, and then when there are toxic mediators that are released, how that chronic kind of neuroinflammation might explain the pathogenesis of many of the neurodegenerative disorders is something that's very exciting. And of course, looking at HIPSC's stem cells, which I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion about. Colleagues have developed stem cells for bipolar mood disorder to look at the effect of lithium on the cells in patients with bipolar mood disorder, similarly in movement disorders and so on. So very, very exciting times in terms of looking at some of the impact of some of these disorders. And when you look at the impact of immunological research on the disease development and the progression, for example, a typical example is antibodies, which has led to the classification of patients with myasthenia gravis depending on the presence of these antibodies. Similarly, autoimmune encephalitis and paraneoplastic conditions, which have been associated with, again, with specific antibodies, development of monoclonal antibodies against disease-specific antigens in a number of conditions. We do know, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, there is a great interest in introducing monoclonal antibodies to arrest the progression of the disease. And of course, the widespread use of immunotherapeutic agents to augment chemotherapy, particularly in cancers. Another very important area that we've been looking at is screening for inborn errors of metabolism. So colleagues for the last almost 20 years have developed assays to look at inborn errors of amino acid metabolism, fatty acid oxidation, organic acidemias. There are several analytes that they look at. And what they have been able to do is do a dry spot, which can be sent on a postcard to NIMHANS for analysis, for detection. And this is so important because just eliminating something in the diet, adding something in the diet can actually get rid of a whole host of neurological, cognitive, and developmental problems. And therefore, this is an extremely important area where newborn screening is very, very critical. And this certainly has been very relevant both regionally as well as nationally and internationally. Then moving on to the neuromuscular laboratory, we get a lot of children and adults with congenital neuromuscular disorders, and therefore we are able to, right from immunodiagnosis, molecular diagnosis, enzyme assays, as well as, we're able to look at advanced neuropathies and neuromuscular disorders using the application of all of these techniques. We also have developed a method now of assaying for heavy metals, including lead, and we have the ICP-MS recently, and that helps us to understand particularly the role of environmental toxins, both on cellular as well as clinical manifestations of disease. I move on next to the behavioral sciences, where psychiatry, child psychiatry, clinical psychology, psychiatric social work, nursing, integrative medicine, which looks at yoga and Ayurveda, at least at NIMHANS, and of course disaster management. We've been doing a lot of work on suicide prevention, suicide follow-up. We have a very unique family psychiatry ward where we admit patients with their family members to not only understand the manifestation of disease, but also to help them. And we have a department of psychosocial care and disaster management, which has been doing a lot of training. But again, in terms of understanding the biological implications of disaster, possibly the epigenetic effects of disaster, this is an absolutely good place to be able to do studies of that kind. We really haven't progressed enough, I believe, in that area, and that's something that's very exciting. So when you look at this particular article by Patel et al., talks about how mental health in different aspects of the life course, how people might be at risk because, let's say, right from pregnancy to nutrition to inadequate stimulation to the environment and familial risk can affect people right through their entire lifespan. and of course, what kind of causes poor mental health conditions. So you really using a lifespan approach, a developmental approach, and understanding what are mitigating factors, what are upstream factors to produce disorders which cause downstream effects. It's a very comprehensive way of understanding this particular problem, and therefore one looks at neurodevelopmental disorders, adolescent disorders, adult disorders, and disorders of the elderly along this particular mental health continuum. And understanding the biology and understanding the interaction of the environment with the individual becomes very important for this kind of understanding. So one of the landmark projects, of course, has been the TeleManus. All of you know that throughout the country, one can call 14416 to actually get help in about 22 different languages. Why am I mentioning TeleManus to a group of scientists here? Because the application of artificial intelligence to prediction in suicide, for example, to prediction in relapses in psychosis, for example, are very, very important and exciting areas of research. So with huge amounts of call data, the likelihood of picking up these kind of risk factors is very high, and that's what makes these kind of arrangements very exciting also for research given the current scenario. Similarly, we have the Department of Integrative Medicine at NIMHANS, which looks at trying to look at not having isolated siloed interventions for people, but actually providing integrative approaches and studying the way the integrative approaches actually work, whether it's in terms of electrophysiological changes, imaging changes, genetic, the epigenetic changes. A lot of that is being developed, and also to understand from an ethnopharmacological perspective how Ayurvedic drugs help and what kind of side effects they may have. So really looking at all of this is something that the Department of Integrative Medicine does. In terms of interventions, we've been very interested in neuromodulation research, and I'll just talk about it in a bit. We've been looking at neurosurgery for obsessive compulsive disorder, telemedicine, something I mentioned. And there's a large study called the Enigma OCD study, as well as the bipolar study, which is trying to look at patients from all over the country, again, with different ethnic backgrounds, trying to understand from a multidisciplinary perspective what poses them to risk to develop these disorders and recovery from these disorders. I mentioned neuromodulation. So repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation is something that colleagues are looking at in a series of psychiatric disorders, from depression to addiction, as well as from movement disorders, stroke, and so on, in a wide variety of areas. Similarly, transcranial direct magnetic stimulation is also being looked at to see what kind of impact it can have, for example, on neuroplasticity. And the fact that these, in addition to electroconvulsive therapy, which is still very commonly used, to see what kind of benefits and what kind of side effects may be occurring as a result of this kind of neuromodulation. We have a very large Welcome DBT project looking at neuromodulation at NIMHANS. And next, I'd like to go to some of the large collaborations we've had. This is something called the CVEDA. And Sona was just mentioning that there's a lot of data which has already been generated in terms of looking at young people at risk for developing addiction. These are the children or first-degree relatives of people who already developed addiction, to see what kind of maturation of their brains occurs, what kind of electrophysiological changes occur, and of course looking at the genetic aspects of it and seeing what determines the conversion of non-use to addiction, and can we predict people who are likely to develop this. This has also resulted in a brain atlas of how brains mature at different ages, and that has been a very exciting contribution. Similarly, we have the Center for Brain and Mind, and this became possible initially with the DBT funding and subsequently with the Rohini Nilekani philanthropy funding with the NCBS, where we're looking at a variety of conditions, cross-cutting conditions, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, OCD, addictions, dementia, as well as healthy controls, looking at both individuals at risks and people who do not have a family history, and looking not just at their clinical aspects in terms of temperament, in terms of their disease manifestation, but also looking at genetic vulnerabilities, environmental risks, doing detailed neuropsychological assessment, structural MRIs, functional MRIs, other spectroscopic studies, electrophysiological studies, and eye tracking, and looking at the commonalities as well as the differences across these disorders. So once again, looking at the brain and mind in a kind of congruent manner and seeing why certain people develop certain symptoms and disorders and others don't is really the most exciting question before all of us. This has also translated into a study called Param, where we are looking across a variety of mental as well as neurological disorders, trying to see what the genome contributes, what the exposome contributes, and the inflammasome as well, considering the inflammatory explanations for disease conditions. We're also looking at a variety of variables. We're working with colleagues in the United States to see how variables can also influence the way you can monitor patient symptoms and predict relapse. We do therapeutic drug monitoring for a variety of antipsychotic medications. We've standardized those processes. We test for drugs of abuse. We are the World Health Organization testing agency for tobacco-related products as well. And we have a large number of cohorts. We also work with the Center for Brain and Mind in terms of developing some of these cohorts for perinatal care, for addiction, for psychiatric disorders, and now for neurological disorders as well. Recently, we've been able to digitize about 37,000 patient records from 1850s to 1974. And we, of course, have a hospital information management system. So there should be a huge amount of data that is available for analysis in the days to come. Last part of my presentation, I talk about the neurosciences, particularly neurology and neurosurgery, and the supportive departments that we have. There's some very exciting work in neurology on dementias, particularly on cognitive screening, and of course providing multidisciplinary care. Movement disorders, again, a very, very huge amount of work has been done in terms of a whole lot of array of both diagnostic as well as therapeutic interventions. Epilepsy, stroke, we have part of a stroke registry, and of course epilepsy surgeries. We're looking at developing pediatric neurology services, so neurodevelopmental disorders again becomes very, very important. We are part of global neuro coalitions and as for neuroinfections as well. And CUBI is a very interesting public health model of neurology that colleagues have started to take out diagnostics and screening into the community. And this again is a very exciting area which has now become national. In neurosurgery, traumatic brain injuries, neuro-oncologies, use of robotics, microvascular surgery, movement disorder surgery, disorders of the spine, etc. We've established a neurosurgical skills lab, and this is again very, very interesting for hands-on training in neurosurgery. Similarly, neuroanesthesia and neuroimaging interventional radiology, huge opportunities there for research that are available, particularly brain imaging and mapping, both structural and functional, CT, PET and EEG, and other measures. We also have a cyclotron. We generate radioisotopes, which we make available to other institutions to use. Again, a huge amount of research opportunities as far as PET is concerned. Of course, we do know that, again, using big data can be very, very important for translational research. Neuromodulation, I already mentioned, in various kinds of movement disorders. And of course, we've been involved in the National Mental Health Survey, first in 2016. We are undertaking one now in all the states and union territories to understand the extent of the services. In terms of academic capacity, we do a lot of postgraduate training, particularly in terms of research. We have a fair number of research projects and outputs as well. And there have been some innovations. This is the part where I'm not very I believe we have a long way to go in terms of patents, in terms of developing incubation centers, in terms of having many more innovations. I believe we have the capacity to do it, but I think that's where collaboration with other basic science researchers becomes extremely important. So moving forward, what are the opportunities for research and clinicians to work together? Brain imaging, genomics, drug discovery and development, neuroinformatics, and of course, looking at brain-computer interface is another very exciting aspect of today's world. And finally, of course, personalized medicine to really determine what kind of combination of environmental and genetic factors make for a certain disease and going forward with that. So we have a lot of national collaborations as well as international collaborations. I don't have time to go into each one of these. They have been very, very useful. And I think as we go on, we will go towards a more developmental approach, trying to understand neurocircuitry and neurotransmitters in much more detail, understanding how psychopathology develops, targeted interventions. We still need better tools and approaches. And I think we're moving towards that. And of course, protection of the brain and mind, detection of an early intervention and restitution of function becomes very important. And for that, we need a multidisciplinary and a multi-technology and a bridge understanding of the brain and mind with, of course, since we're dealing with people, humanism also combined with that. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you explain the crosstalk between brain and mind? How do they
crosstalk? Okay, a typical example is, let us take any neurodegenerative disorder, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's Parkinsonism. Inevitably, there are motor symptoms that occur, there are cognitive symptoms that occur, there are emotional symptoms that occur, and there are behavioral symptoms that occur. Generally, the emotional and the behavioral are likely to be studied more by psychiatrists, whereas the movement disorder part of it, are maybe the cognitive is shared between the two. So I think really a approach, a trans-theoretical approach, a transdisciplinary approach is very, very important to understanding why is it that some people, like for example in frontotemporal dementias, present more with behavioral problems, whereas Alzheimer's present earlier with cognitive problems. And these are some things that we still haven't understood. And that really is the crosstalk. Similarly, the crosstalk between psychiatric disorders. Why is it that certain people with a family history of schizophrenia develop schizophrenia and some others develop bipolar mood disorder? What are the commonalities? Maybe in terms of these tools that we have, maybe in terms of the exposome. That's something that we need to understand.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the talk. I have been waiting to ask this question whole my life, honestly. I wanted to know at NIMHANS or India, where does we stand in the migraine diagnosis and research? Because the mechanisms are not well established. There are still hypotheses. And speaking from the first-hand experience, I really want to know where do we stand and how can we contribute to the development of that diagnosis.
So, again, I do not claim any expertise in migraine, so I don't think I would be the appropriate person to answer that question. But you said you all your life have been concerned. There are people, I'm sure 3 times your age, who have also been quite concerned about it. So one does look particularly at vascular phenomena, inflammation. I think the challenging part has been to have a proper drug for the prophylaxis of migraine, which does not produce side effects. So I think we do have some progress in terms of how do you acutely manage migraine, but in terms of migraine prophylaxis, we still don't have an ideal drug which prevents it without producing side effects. So understanding the etiopathogenesis therefore becomes important to try and see whether you can have more specific drugs which act particularly on particular arterial systems of the brain. I think that's going to be a very important challenge.
Just one question, is there any relationship between these neurodegenerative diseases and the profession? Because I have seen some of the neurodegenerative diseases, most of the academicians affect and politicians have these diseases. So is there any relation like that?
So colleagues have tried a lot to look at IQ and the development of disorders, I do not, in my understanding, I do not believe that there are very clear-cut patterns. It is perhaps likely that it becomes much more obvious in people who have very, very high cognitive abilities and reserves when they develop these disorders vis-a-vis others. But we know across the population, and we do know that, in fact, quite the contrary. In fact, the literature probably suggests that nutrition, education, exposure to a lot of information and language proficiency, those are all protective, in fact. The literature suggests quite the opposite.
Dr. Murthy, thank you. That was a very interesting talk. I was wondering, you mentioned a Department of Integrative Medicine. So what are the neurological disorders where you find that integrative medicine is working best? I'm just curious to sort of know about it.
I think one shouldn't jump the gun too much, because they have been used as complementary to, for example, definitely movement disorders, in persons with dementia to some extent. But I think actually discerning, yoga is perhaps a little easier to understand, because yoga can then, can be reduced to the number of sessions you do, the kind of, whether it's a pranayam that you do or an asana that you do perhaps. But some of the other kind of procedures require a certain change in one's lifestyle, complete lifestyle, and measuring that and having the proper metrics to determine what has been your attitudinal change to life, your, what do they call, pratiharas, etc., etc. That is very challenging. So I don't believe, there is literature to suggest, for example, that certain kriyas, certain pranayamas seem to help in these disorders. But I wouldn't go to, to make that a solid, completely evidence-based recommendation so far. I mean, I think we just need to understand it better. But I think what my colleagues in NIMHANS are doing is really trying to apply the same methods of studying, other kinds of, what we call Western methods of treatment to these methods. And therefore, at least we can get comparators. Right. Now, whether they will have the same thing by disproof, as Western methods of approach, or whether we will have some unique findings is, I think, remains to be seen.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. Thanks a lot.